In 1948, at Chakeri near Kanpur in northern India, a consolidated B-24 Liberator sat among rows of other four-engine bombers that had already been written off. Some had been stripped, some had damaged fuselages, some were missing instruments or other equipment. They were not waiting for another combat mission. They had been gathered there because, as far as their former owner was concerned, their useful lives were over. Yet mechanics were now working on one of them for an extraordinary reason. They were not trying to restore it fully. The factory capable of doing that was far away, at Bangalore in southern India. The first objective was much more limited. They had to make the discarded bomber flyable enough for a single ferry journey. Only after it had flown roughly 1,500 kilometers could the real rebuilding begin. That contradiction defines the story of the Kanpur Liberators. These were aircraft that had already been declared surplus, and many had been deliberately disabled. But a newly independent Air Force needed bombers. Hindustan Aircraft had wartime experience repairing Liberators, and inside the rows of unwanted machines at Chakeri were enough usable structures, engines, instruments, and parts to make an idea that sounded unreasonable, just barely practical. One aircraft provides a way to follow what happened. Before it became an Indian Air Force machine, it was an American-built B-24L, carrying the United States serial number 44-50206. Ford completed it at Willow Run on the 5th of December 1944. Under Lend-Lease, it entered British service as KN751, and like many Liberators bound for the Far East, it traveled a long ferry route before reaching India. It passed through North America, crossed the Atlantic route, continued through North Africa and the Middle East, and eventually joined the Royal Air Force in Asia. KN751 served with No. 99 Squadron during the closing months of the war. It was not an old bomber by any normal measure. It had left the factory only near the end of 1944, and the war against Japan ended less than a year later. The problem was not that the aircraft had become ancient. The problem was that the strategic world around it had changed faster than the machine itself. On the 11th of April 1946, KN751 was struck off Royal Air Force charge at Chakeri. Barely 16 months had passed since its completion at Willow Run. An aircraft that had required an enormous industrial effort to build, ferry, and operate had gone from new production to disposal in less than a year and a half. KN751 was not alone. During the war, Chakeri had been associated with No. 322 Maintenance Unit, part of the Royal Air Force repair and maintenance system in India. Aircraft had once arrived there because they needed to be repaired and returned to service. After the war, the direction of that traffic changed. Chakeri became a concentration point for aircraft leaving service, including nearly 100 Liberators. The end of Lend-Lease and the enormous post-war reduction in Allied air forces made these bombers expensive surplus. Britain had little reason to keep a large, heavy bomber fleet in India, and transporting all those machines elsewhere was hardly an attractive solution. Many of the Liberators were deliberately made unusable before being abandoned. Later accounts describe damaged fuselages, stripped cockpits, missing components, and engines that had been disabled. Some describe vehicles being used to damage airframes and sand being put into engines. What is clear is that the aircraft were not simply parked in perfect condition and forgotten. Many had been intentionally deprived of any easy path back into service. But the damage was not uniform. A graveyard of aircraft is rarely a graveyard of identical wrecks. One bomber might have a sounder fuselage but be missing equipment. Another might be beyond realistic recovery as a complete aircraft but still contain useful components. A third might have engines or instruments that could be removed and installed elsewhere. That difference would become important after India gained independence. By 1947, the new Indian Air Force faced a very different problem from the one that had created the graveyard. Fighting in Kashmir revealed that the service lacked a purpose-built heavy bomber. Dakotas, designed as transports, could be adapted to carry bombs in an improvised role. Bombs could be carried inside the aircraft and released manually from the cargo area. It provided some strike capability, but it did not turn the Dakota into a real heavy bomber. India needed something more suitable. One possibility was to acquire Avro Lancasters from Britain. Another possibility was sitting at Kanpur. Group Captain Harjinder Singh and other Indian Air Force officers began looking seriously at the discarded Liberators. The idea was not simply to take a few parked aircraft, refuel them, and declare them operational. The machines had been written off. Many had been damaged. Components had been removed. Years of exposure had not improved their condition. But there was one advantage that made the proposal more realistic than it first appeared. Hindustan Aircraft at Bangalore already knew the type. During the Second World War, the Bangalore organization had repaired and maintained a wide range of Allied aircraft, including the Liberator. The engineers who would be asked to rebuild these machines were therefore not confronting an unknown design. They had experience with the B-24 from the years when it was still a frontline wartime aircraft. That changed the question. The issue was no longer whether any one abandoned Liberator was complete. The issue was whether the entire field contained enough usable material to create complete aircraft. A Hindustan Aircraft team was sent to Chakeri. A detailed Indian Air Force historical account identifies the group as working under a man named Yellappa. Their first task was selection. They had to walk through the rows of Liberators and decide which airframes were worth trying to save and which were more valuable as sources of parts. The graveyard had become an inventory. Saving every Liberator was never the realistic objective. Some airframes were too damaged or incomplete to justify the labor required to return them to flight, but those aircraft could still contribute engines, instruments, and components to machines with better prospects. A bomber that would never leave Chakeri could therefore help another one do exactly that. That was the logic of cannibalization. Parts from aircraft judged beyond recovery were removed and used to complete the better candidates. A sounder structure might receive equipment from one donor and additional components from another. The program did not require every abandoned bomber to survive. It required enough usable material across the entire field to create a smaller number of complete aircraft. That also meant the rebuilt fleet would eventually carry the individuality of the recovery process. These were not simply untouched factory aircraft being returned to service. Each candidate arrived with its own combination of surviving equipment, replacement parts, and previous damage. At Kanpur, however, the immediate problem was even more fundamental. The real overhaul facilities were at Bangalore. A B-24 was a large four-engine bomber with a wingspan of roughly 110 feet. Moving complete Liberators that distance by road or rail would have created a major dismantling and transport problem of its own. So the recovery program was divided into two very different stages. At Kanpur, selected aircraft were repaired only far enough to make a ferry flight possible. At Bangalore, they would receive the full strip-down, overhaul, and refurbishment required for regular service. The first restoration was therefore not intended to return a bomber to combat. It was intended to get the bomber to the place where the real restoration could begin. That distinction matters. When one of these aircraft started its engines at Chakeri, it had not yet become a finished Indian Air Force Liberator. It was still a recovered machine being prepared for one journey. The complete inspection and refurbishment would come later. Every donor part installed at Kanpur therefore served an immediate purpose. Every repair moved one chosen airframe closer to the point where it could leave the graveyard. Too little work and the aircraft could not make the journey. But there was no reason to reproduce an entire Bangalore overhaul facility beside the scrap field. The method was practical because it used the aircraft's own original purpose as part of the transportation system. If the bomber could fly, it could move itself. The pilot most closely associated with these ferry flights was Jamshed Kaikobad Munshi, usually known as Jimmy Munshi, the chief test pilot of Hindustan Aircraft. Later Indian Air Force accounts describe a situation very different from the normal introduction of a new aircraft type. There was no pristine training fleet waiting on a flight line. There were damaged Liberators in a disposal area, incomplete documentation, and aircraft that had been repaired only far enough to reach the overhaul facility. One detailed account says Munshi and the team gathered surviving pages of B-24 operating material from aircraft in the graveyard and assembled enough information to work from. The same account describes the ferry flights being made with the landing gear left extended rather than relying on the retraction system during the journey. The detail is revealing because it shows the logic of temporary airworthiness. Leaving the wheels down created extra drag and reduced performance, but it also avoided depending on a complete retraction and extension cycle from a system that had not yet received its definitive overhaul. The aircraft did not need to perform every function exactly as it had in wartime. It needed to perform the functions required to reach Bangalore. Then came the moment on which the whole idea depended. A Liberator that had been sitting among discarded bombers started its engines, taxied, and accelerated along the runway at Chakeri. 4 engines that had no future in the post-war Royal Air Force were now being asked to carry the aircraft into a completely different one. The bomber lifted away from Kanpur and turned toward Bangalore. The journey was roughly 1,500 kilometers. At the beginning of it, the aircraft was still essentially a recovered machine being ferried for overhaul. At the end, it would enter the facility where Hindustan Aircraft could dismantle and rebuild it for sustained military use. This was the irreversible point in the recovery story. Before that takeoff, the idea of creating a bomber force from the Chakeri graveyard was still a proposal based on engineering judgment and available parts. Once a discarded Liberator had flown away under its own power, the method had worked. That did not make the remaining aircraft routine projects. Every candidate had its own combination of damage, missing equipment, and exposure. The next airframe still had to be selected. Parts still had to be recovered. Temporary repairs still had to be completed. Another ferry flight still had to succeed. What changed was the status of the idea itself. A graveyard could produce an airplane, and an airplane could reach Bangalore. The recovery effort therefore proceeded aircraft by aircraft rather than as one mass resurrection. There was never a moment when nearly 100 discarded Liberators suddenly became serviceable. A smaller number moved through a series of thresholds. First, an airframe had to be judged worth saving. Then donor parts had to make the aircraft sufficiently complete. Then it had to leave Kanpur. Only after reaching Bangalore could it begin the transformation from temporary survivor to dependable military aircraft. At Hindustan Aircraft, the character of the work changed completely. The bomber could now be stripped down and rebuilt. Components could be repaired or replaced. Systems could be restored for sustained service rather than a single ferry journey. The experience accumulated by Hindustan Aircraft during the war now mattered again, but for a purpose nobody could have predicted when the company had been repairing Allied aircraft against Japan. The same type that once arrived as part of an imperial wartime logistics system was now being rebuilt for the Air Force of independent India. KN751 was one of the Liberators that passed through this transformation. Its identity changed with its second life. In Indian service, it became HE807. A Hindustan aircraft inspection plate associated with the aircraft records the 2nd of March 1949, a physical trace of the period when the former Royal Air Force bomber was being returned to service. HE807 is particularly useful because its documented history shows what the program actually accomplished. It had not been discovered untouched in a hangar. It had been discarded at Chakeri. It then entered the recovery system that drew aircraft, parts, and labor from the dump. And it emerged not as a static restoration, but as an operational Indian Air Force Liberator. The program was already producing results before HE807's own recorded inspection date. By November 1948, the first 6 reconstructed Liberators had been completed, allowing No. 5 Squadron to form with the type on the 2nd of November. The exact final number recovered or rebuilt is surprisingly difficult to state. Different historical sources give figures in the mid-30s, high 30s, low 40s, and, in some accounts, still higher totals. They may not all be counting the same stage of the process. Some may refer to aircraft recovered from the dump. Others may mean aircraft ferried, rebuilt, or eventually supplied for service. The surviving evidence does not allow those numbers to be reconciled with certainty. The safest conclusion is also the most useful one. Around 40 Liberators emerged from the Indian recovery and rebuild effort in one form or another. Whatever the exact number, this was no longer the story of one exceptionally fortunate airframe. It was the creation of a fleet. That fact changes the scale of Kanpur. One bomber flying again could be treated as a remarkable individual restoration. 6 aircraft, forming the beginning of a squadron, already meant something larger. More than 36 machines returning through the program meant the graveyard had become part of India's aircraft supply system. And the rebuilt Liberators did not merely survive a few proving flights. They worked. No. 5 Squadron used the B-24 in the bomber role. Other Indian units also operated the type, and No. 6 Squadron would give the Liberator its longest and perhaps most revealing second career. By the 1950s, the aircraft was increasingly associated with maritime reconnaissance rather than the heavy bomber mission that had helped justify its recovery. That role placed the rebuilt machines into a demanding routine. Accounts from former No. 6 Squadron personnel describe maritime search patterns flown at around 500 feet and sorties lasting 8 hours or more. The aircraft carried radar and other specialized equipment. Later, sonobuoys and depth charges formed part of their anti-submarine capability. There is also documentary evidence from HE807 itself that shows how far the aircraft had come from the Chakeri dump. On the 25th of May 1955, a recorded flight took HE807 from Pune through Ratnagiri, Jodhpur and Kota before returning to Pune. The log records roughly half an hour of daylight flying and 8.5 hours at night, with 2 navigators aboard. 6 years after its Hindustan Aircraft inspection date, the former KN751 was not merely airworthy. It was undertaking a flight lasting about 9 hours. That is a stronger test of the rebuild program than any ceremonial display could have provided. An aircraft repaired only well enough to escape a graveyard might survive one ferry journey. An aircraft capable of remaining airborne for hour after hour, returning repeatedly to squadron service, and continuing that routine years later, had become something entirely different. It had become a working military aircraft again. Yet the Liberators also carried reminders of how individually they had been reconstructed. One former No. 6 Squadron signals officer later described radar problems on aircraft that seemed normal when the radar equipment itself was tested separately. The trouble led technicians back into the aircraft wiring. Maintenance personnel told him that wiring arrangements could differ from one Liberator to another, turning fault tracing into a fresh investigation each time. Whether every difference came directly from the original rebuild process is impossible to establish. But the episode reveals how individual these reconstructed aircraft had become. They were not 40 machines emerging together from the same production line. They were survivors with different histories of repair, replacement, and continued maintenance. By the end of the 1950s, more modern aircraft had replaced the Liberator in the bomber role. No. 5 and No. 16 Squadron moved on to the Canberra, while No. 6 continued operating the B-24 for maritime duties. The aircraft that had originally been rescued because India needed heavy bombers survived longest, doing something different. They were still flying during Operation Vijay in 1961, when Indian Liberators carried out maritime reconnaissance around Goa, Daman, and Da. On the 18th of December, aircraft of the type were also used to drop surrender leaflets over Goa. They continued maritime patrol duties during the 1965 conflict. By then, the B-24 belonged to another aviation era. Aircraft that had been considered expendable surplus in 1946 were still performing military duties almost 20 years later. The end finally came in December 1968. No. 6 Squadron made its last Liberator sortie on the 24th of December. Squadron history remembers it as a mercy mission. Formal retirement followed on the 31st. After roughly 2 decades of Indian service, the aircraft recovered from the post-war graveyard were finished at last. Or so it seemed. HE807, the former KN751, went into open storage at Pune. Its engines were silent again. Its active military career was over. Once more, a Liberator that had already been rescued from abandonment sat without an operational future. Then the RAF Museum selected it for preservation in Britain. Rather than dismantle the Liberator for shipment, the plan became to return HE807 to airworthy condition and let the aircraft make the journey under its own power. In April 1973, Hindustan Aircraft surveyed the old bomber and concluded that it could be returned to flight. More than 25 years after the Kanpur recovery program, HE807 entered another restoration process. Work began in earnest in May 1974. The engines were run on the ground, systems were checked, the aircraft was prepared for a test flight. On the 18th of June, HE807 took off for about 25 minutes. The landing gear would not retract. The following day it flew again. Again, the undercarriage failed to retract. There is no evidence that this problem had the same technical cause as the gear-down ferry flights described in the earlier Kanpur accounts, and it would be misleading to suggest otherwise. But the visual echo is difficult to miss. Decades after discarded Liberators had reportedly crossed India with their wheels hanging below them, one of those same survivors was airborne again, once more with its undercarriage remaining in view. The problem did not end the effort. On the 20th of June 1974, HE807 flew from Pune to Bangalore, covering roughly 500 miles in 2 hours and 45 minutes, so that further work could be carried out at Hindustan Aircraft. Bangalore had rebuilt the bomber once after its first abandonment. Now the aircraft had returned there before another long flight into yet another life. Further testing followed. Then, on the 1st of July 1974, HE807 was formally handed over for its journey to Britain. It departed Bangalore under Royal Air Force markings and began working its way west. The route took the Liberator through Bombay, Abu Dhabi, Jeddah, Cairo, and Rome before it finally reached Britain. On the 7th of July, it landed at RAF Lyneham. The aircraft had not arrived in a crate. It had not been reduced to a fuselage on a transport ship. A bomber built at Willow Run in 1944, discarded at Chakeri in 1946, rebuilt in India, operated for years, retired in 1968 and restored again in the 1970s, had flown itself from India to the country that had once written it off. HE807 was not the only former Indian Liberator to make an extraordinary final journey. HE773, formerly Royal Air Force KN820, was transferred to Canada in 1968. Its delivery became Operation Long Haul. The aircraft covered roughly 16,900 kilometers, logged 69 flying hours, and made 11 fuel stops on the way from India to Canada. The journey included mechanical difficulties of its own, but the Liberator reached its destination and survives today in Canada's National Aviation Collection. Another former Indian aircraft, HE877, whose earlier identities included Royal Air Force KH-304 and United States Serial 44-44175, eventually reached the United States and is preserved at the Pima Air and Space Museum in Arizona. HE924 remains in India at the Indian Air Force Museum in New Delhi. Other former Indian Liberators survive in the United States as well. That survival record gives the Kanpur story an ending that the people who created the graveyard could hardly have anticipated. Nearly 100 Liberators had been gathered at Chakeri because the war was over and their former owners no longer needed them. Many were deliberately disabled. Some never left the field. Some disappeared piece by piece as donor aircraft, giving engines, instruments, and components to machines judged more recoverable. Around 40, depending on how the surviving records are counted, returned through the Indian program and helped create an operational force. For years they flew not as curiosities but as working aircraft. They served bomber squadrons, trained crews, searched the sea, carried radar, flew long maritime patrols, and remained useful long after most wartime Liberators elsewhere had disappeared from frontline service. And when their Indian service finally ended, a remarkable number survived yet another transition. They became museum aircraft in India, Britain, Canada, and the United States. Today, HE807 sits inside the RAF Museum. The preserved aircraft is separated by decades from the rows of damaged bombers at Chakeri, but they are the same story. Its metal carries the history of an aircraft built in America for one air force, flown to Asia for another, discarded in India, recovered for a third, and then restored once more so that it could cross continents into preservation. The remarkable thing about the Kanpur bomber graveyard is therefore not simply that some old airplanes were found and repaired. It is that a field created to dispose of heavy bombers became the raw material for an air force. The aircraft that could not be saved gave parts to the ones that could. The machines repaired only enough to escape Kanpur flew to Bangalore for complete rebuilding. Those rebuilt aircraft then served for roughly 2 decades, and several survived long enough to become some of the Liberators the world can still see today. For most aircraft gathered at Chakeri, the graveyard really was the end. For a handful of B-24s, it was where the second life began.